This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
What's up? What do you want to talk about today?
I don't know.
What if I told you?
Remotely Rubying?
I have a cursed idea thing I did. Y'all are familiar with Storybook, I assume?
Nope, never heard of it.
Cool. So Storybook is a tool to build and architect components.
Stories?
Typically,
Books?
Yeah, stories. Typically in React.
Plays.
Yeah, it's a play.
Musicals.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is a play a musical?
No, a play is not a musical. A musical is a play.
A musical is a play. There we go.
Yeah.
Are you dead before you're born?
Yes. Because what's the opposite of alive?
Continue.
So in Ruby, Storybook is a really cool tool, especially if you're architecting your components, right? Well, why do I use the keyword type for like these components, but then the keyword variant for these? And shouldn't they actually be two things? And like maybe I use scheme somewhere else, and right? So it's a really, really helpful tool to like visualize all your components, keep
And
track
the
of them.
prompts.
Yeah. You can automatically set it so that toggling, it's like a plugin for toggling your props on and off is active and setting the text. And maybe if you have a button component, like you have a leading icon and a trailing icon and then just icon and then text. And so visualizing all those changes and accessibility checks, and you can actually write tests for them and all this really cool stuff. So Storybook is a really, really cool tool. Lookbook is actually a tool that is a Rails engine, and I assume it's an engine. I've never actually looked at it, but
I'm pretty sure it's an engine.
I think it would have to be an engine.
It shifts with its own styles.
Yeah, then it's definitely an engine. But it's kind of in the same
Maybe not
thing.
definitely.
Caboose.
I'm pretty sure it's an engine.
I mean,
It runs on its own.
It's likely, but I don't know that we can say definitely just because it has its own styles.
I could if I opened up our gem file, but I'm just not interested in doing
Yeah, what if he uses a CDN? Then is it an engine? I don't know.
Yeah. If Harry Styles changes his last name, is he still Styles?
that. No.
Harry Sass.
Harry jQuery?
I heard jQuery. Anyway, so there's a Ruby gem for creating Storybook stories for Ruby. It's basically a DSL that wraps, you kind of write them almost like tests and then outputs them all to JSON, and you have to rerun it every time you modify your components to like regenerate this JSON structure that Storybook then reads in and blah. I think it's really cool. I'm not really a fan, although I'm very, very appreciative of the work that went into it, because without it, the creator, I think his name is John, was actually working with Storybook, and all of these changes to let Storybook work in different environments kind of was prompted from this person. I'm kind of pushing it forward. So shout out to that guy. But I don't like the DSL part. And also it doesn't work if you're not in Rails, right? So you have to have Rails in order to use it, but you can use a view component in other places. And I was talking to Harry at work, our coworker Harry, and I had
Harry jQuery?
Yeah, Harry jQuery. And I had this hypothesis because I'm like, in a normal setting in Storybook, you are writing your stories in JavaScript. And then Storybook is like, okay, here's my JavaScript story. And you like basically bind to like your component, or you write it in line as HTML or whatever. But I was like, look, what if instead of this really complicated DSL, which doesn't really map to anything in the docs, it's like hard to figure out and all this other stuff. What if we were actually rendering the components in the JavaScript stories the way Storybook intends it to be? I just write my Ruby component call in the JavaScript file and JS ERB. Here we are. It's like, because you can put ERB into a JavaScript file in Rails and in other frameworks like Bridgetown, and then Rails will then compile that. Is compile the right word? I don't know.
It is now.
Then, yeah, it is now. And it will evaluate that ERB into what it will then be on, like when it rendered out. So I had this hypothesis that you could do this with Storybook, where you have a directory basically of all your stories. And then Storybook is basically, like, oh, well, all the stories are over here and I can just grab them. Last night in Bridgetown, I tested this hypothesis by writing ERB stories that are JavaScript and then putting in my render component calls directly inside of them. And I actually ended up going with MDX because you can write stories with MDX or JavaScript. But because Bridgetown requires the front matter dashes at the top of a file to know that it should evaluate the ERB inside of it, I used MDX and it just worked perfectly, because in JavaScript, it didn't like that at all. Surprisingly, I don't know why I didn't like foreign syntax just directly inside of it. But at the end of the night, I had all of my stories. All I did was put my render component call directly inside of the story, have Bridgetown turn that ERB into just a JavaScript file, and then point the Storybook server to that directory in my output folder. And so now I have Storybook working, and it took like an hour. So I'm just wondering if we could do that in Rails, to have Rails actually output the stories into a directory, or if that's possible anyway.
I'm sure there's got to be a way to do it. What's the MDX format? When you mentioned that, I was like, realized I don't think I have fiddled with that before.
MDX it's Markdown with JavaScript capability. So like JavaScript is evaluated.
Markdown Extreme.
Yeah. I mean, so Bridgetown doesn't have a fancy name for it like they do in JavaScript land, but you could do the same thing in Bridgetown where you write Markdown, but then you are calling Ruby stuff inside of it and rendering components and all that.
Is this us getting back to PHP days where you just write your PHP inside the HTML? And is this what's happening right now? We're like reinventing that?
Going
Markdown in JavaScript, though? That was like one of the funny things, though, like learning Rails and not being able to just put stuff right in the file. If you learn PHP and you just write a PHP file and it magically executes that code, it is weird to have to like set up a server and then proxy stuff between them and whatever. It seemed like a lot of extra work or whatever when you're learning. But yeah, that's cool. I think with View Component and Flex and all the stuff that's going on right now around components and sort of the back-end version of them is pretty cool. That is such a crucial thing for you to be able to test that stuff where it's like, here's all the specific states of my video player or whatever other components you got. You want to be able to like drop in some test data and just say, here's my test. Does it work right? Yes or no? And then be able to see them visually and everything. That's great. It's really nice. It seems like a good direction to go because if you get Tailwind UI or whatever, you got all this like pre-made sort of design that you want to be able to use with your backend. So you need to generate the same stuff that matches. And they only really, I think, support React components anymore, but we don't always use that, and having Flex and View Component and whatnot, and then being able to do things like this, wire them all up together. It's cool. It's really nice. It's like a way of actually wrangling the views that Rails never really has had. It's been kind of like, here's the back end. Good luck on the front end. Do whatever you want. We don't care. We're not going to like help you really at all. Like no organization for you.
And it's not just organization. It's like architecture.
Yeah.
When we're building Rails views, we're like, oh, I just need to slap this HTML on the page and here's my ERB and then I'm good to go. We're not as much architecting our views in the sense of like when you're building with components, there's a lot more thought that goes into it, especially if you have a team that's really good at component architecture. And then you come out with this system that is, if you've ever gone to reskin an app, it's a disaster usually in Rails because everything is implemented differently. There's no consistency. ERB is not something that there are many great formatters for, except for one that I found. And it's just really, really hard. But when you have these really rich component architectures, like you have to spend a lot of time like actually thinking about the way your features look and the way your buttons work and the way this works and the way that works. And with a lot more architecture, you come out with a way cleaner solution and one that's way more maintainable.
Yeah, the baseline standard these days is not just like blank forms and really basic select boxes and whatnot. It's like you actually need buttons with drop downs and you need buttons with icons on the left and the right and loading states and all this other stuff. In order to make a good application these days, you need a lot of advanced little things. Like all those details matter. And that's where this stuff really comes into play because it's enabling you to do that. If you get the components, make them work, then you can reuse them in every application. You can just add new features and it starts to bring you back to those days of when Bootstrap came out and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have to remake tabs from scratch or modals from scratch or like grab the 15 different jQuery plugins. It's kind of bringing you to a more modern version of that where it's like, here, we've got these components. They're standardized so we can use them all the same way throughout our applications or features or whatever it is. And it really like makes it cohesive. And it is the architecture, because it's thinking about it as not just a modal, but a modal that can be small, medium, large, full screen, modals on modals, whatever it might be. You're thinking about all of those. Modals are composed of a backdrop. So you might use the backdrop thing on a lightbox too, or whatever else, other things. Maybe video has a full screen mode and you like put a backdrop on too. You're thinking about it in a nice composable manner that way, because the modals need a cancel button and a confirm button or whatever. And we've got components for those, and that's great. I think it just helps a lot. And I think it also makes it easier for you to just communicate and reason about with non-developers on your team, like the designers and whoever else can think about these things, and you can talk about this button component and you're not like reinventing it each time you got to build one or whatever.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I really like about Storybook is because I'm a visual person, right? I needed to see things visually. And the one thing that really helps me with Storybook is I often find when I'm looking at the way people have implemented components is like, okay, well, this person implemented it with these arguments and this person implemented a different type of it with these arguments, and there's no consistency, right? But when you're building like a robust, maintainable component architecture, you want consistency and you want to not have to guess what a component takes, to remove that cognitive complexity and to just be like, oh, well, I need a button. Also, I find that having like components accept like certain options throughout, like regardless of what it is also a really great pattern. So I'm a big fan on the keyword as, which is something I've discovered somewhere in some React component library, where basically if I'm creating a header, right, I'm using my header component and I'm specifying like it's a level 2. And so by default, the component will make it an H2. I'm in a card that's under another heading that's under the top level heading. So I actually need this to be an H3. So specifying header component dot new as :H3, and then just every single component doing that. So regardless of what component you're using, you can always change the HTML element that's being used. This is especially great for text components, where like you might have a description text or a label or whatever. You can always use the same text component and just modify the element being used underneath. Do the same thing with adding class names or appending class names to the ones that are being configured automatically. So you can always override if you need to.
Yeah, I think that ability to always override those things is important, because otherwise you end up with a description text component and you get these really fine-grained components. And it's kind of the same problem with CSS when you like write too specific of a selector and then you can't use it somewhere else and you can't repurpose it and stuff. It just becomes really painful to work with because it's too specific. And then you need to add a feature to all of them or whatever. And it becomes like just a giant pain to maintain. If you can build that component really modularly like that and say like, look, we don't even specify which H tag it's going to be. We'll set a default. We will let you override it. That is a great way to design those things, because the same thing applies to probably most code you do otherwise too. But the more granular you make it and specific, then it just becomes harder to repurpose and reuse. And that's kind of like the pattern that you might start with, being really specific, and then you like work your way back. But if you're digging in, try to think about those other use cases that you might have, and you can try and write them more flexibly from the beginning. Save yourself a lot of time.
Going back to the text example, if you're like, well, but my label component, when I'm using a label, let's not use a label, let's use a muted summary or whatever, just like information text. I always want it to be this certain text color, and I always want it to be like this certain size and this certain weight. Then that's when you go back to composition, which kind of seems to be the theme of what we're talking about here, where you just make your other component inherit from your base component. So like you have your base text component, you have now your summary text component, and it inherits from your base one. And all it does is just basically sets the defaults for the underlying component.
It's almost an abstract component or something of that sort, where it like doesn't really have any idea how things get rendered. It just knows to tell the other one to render things in that way. And that's really nice, because then it's really composable that way, which is great. I think this is awesome. It would be really cool just to have your Tailwind UI components or something like ready to go that you could drop in and use in any application. Be sweet.
I've started no less than 4 repos, like private repos, trying to do that. And
I have 2.
I know it's not something, because like Tailwind UI is paid, that like I could open up. And I was like, man, it'd be cool if I could just design those and like share it with my friends who have paid for Tailwind UI.
Yeah.
But it's hard to get those abstractions right for me.
It takes practice.
It takes practice. And the other thing is, a lot of times you don't know what a good API is ahead of time. I can't just necessarily sit down and be like, oh, I'm going to flesh out a ton of Tailwind UI components without building an app, because I'm just guessing. And so what I'm doing is I feel like I'm just prematurely optimizing and just making a huge mistake, and I always give up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You probably would need to go, and this is probably what they've done building Tailwind itself. What classes do we need? And building out those UI templates that they have probably influenced a whole lot of, you know what, we don't actually have as fine-grained of text sizes as we actually need, or line heights or something. And it's probably the exact same situation here. Like, if you were to go and implement a bunch of components that were like, oh, we're going to take all those UI templates, create components out of them, and then use them to build the templates, you'll probably see like, okay, this worked for the first one, but then now that we need this other one, the buttons are like totally different, and we need to change the interface for that or whatever. And then you build 4 or 5 different apps with it, and you start to realize, okay, this is more where it should be, but that's so much work. It's a lot to ingest and sort through.
And you could probably look at like how they do it in React and Vue, because like you have those components.
Yeah, good point.
But a lot of those are built on top of a headless UI. So there's like kind of another level of abstraction. Do you build like I know headless UI is more about like the functionality, like the JavaScript and accessibility, but do you have some kind of foundation like that in Vue components then that you like build on? And by the time I started asking those questions and realizing those are hard questions, I don't know. I want to do it, or I want someone else to do it.
It always sounds like a very simple project to go build too. That's the tempting thing to like, screw it, I'll just sit down and do this for an afternoon. And then you're like a few hours in and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even get through buttons.
I want to actually mention, I don't know if we've talked about this. So I kind of, over the past few years, since we're on the topic of Tailwind now, have like ebbed and flowed through loving it and not hating it, but just maybe it's not a good fit for me. And I think I found kind of my sin with it, because Tailwind's focus relevant to this conversation is on like components, right? Hey, like if there's a pattern you're reusing, make it a component. Don't use apply all the time, things like that. But in Rails, like we don't have components out of the box. Also, like I find myself writing the same, like copy and pasting like form inputs in text areas. I don't necessarily want to like make classes for that using apply. So I'm sure somebody, and please tell me how awful an idea this is, but in Jobboardly, what I did was I applied like Tailwind UI text input. I applied that to the root input element in the CSS. And it has made me so happy, because now like my views, when I open a form, it's just like form.text field with no classes, and it just gets that styling. Same thing for like checkboxes, selects, labels. I even use CSS to say like, if there's a label and an input immediately after the label, apply like MT1, which is what Tailwind UI does. And I feel like I've really found my zen with using Tailwind in this project.
Do you run into issues?
CSS there though. You can still use Tailwind because of the way you can now compose with the JIT these classes to tell it, and like the nested attribute selectors to tell it like, hey, every input of this type, set this thing at the top level component. So you don't actually have to use CSS if you don't want to.
When you say use CSS, you mean like have a CSS file?
With the apply stuff.
Okay, yeah. You'll have to show me how to do that, because I'm using apply. I'm not writing any custom styles, but I am like targeting I think they call it layer. And so like layer base is where I target all the just vanilla inputs and their types. Hi, my name is Andrew Mason, and I'd like to tell you about Honey Badger. Whether US East 1 is down or you forget to add a configuration file, everyone has an outage from time to time. When your next outage occurs, transparency is critical. The difference between a minor annoyance that people soon forget and a fiasco that creates sustained resentment is how you communicate. That's why you need Honeybadger. Honeybadger is a crucial component of your incident response plan with their uptime monitoring service that now has an exciting new feature, public status pages. Create a new status page with custom domains, branding, and more. Don't let Twitter be the only way your users can find out if your app's down. Sign up for Honeybadger to improve your incident response with a shiny new status page that you'll be proud to show users. Visit honeybadger.io and start giving your users a better experience today. Let them know that Remote Ruby and specifically Andrew Mason sent you.
Do you run into issues with having to undo some of that stuff if you were to make like text field or a number field with a $, like prefix and .00 suffix kind of thing, so that it looks like a single input, but it's faked where the left and right sides of the input have no borders or whatever, so that they blend into the, I don't know, they call them input groups or whatever in Bootstrap. And
I have run into this. So the nice thing about this approach is that because I'm using a utility framework, I can still override on like a per need basis, like at the input.
Because those are more specific or whatever. So
right.
Cascade.
What cascading style sheets. What I have been doing is, this is where I'm ready for the judgment. Send the pitchforks my way. I have been using more CSS or using apply. But so for example, subdomains are, you say a subdomain and I want to show you .jobboardly.com after it in the input. So in that case, if you have an input and a span next to each other, it will stop doing the curvature on the right side of the text input, and the span will automatically, without anything in the view side, it'll automatically take on the gray background style itself. And then I also have one for doing it where, because with Jobboardly, you enter a minimum and a maximum salary. So that's input, span, input. And without writing any utility classes in the view, other than just flexing those things to line up next to each other properly, I handle all that at that layer. So basically I have input groups without any custom classes for the most part.
Yeah, that's nice. I like it. Because the Tailwind Forms plugin, you can choose to have it style the inputs themselves or add classes. And I use the input stuff like you're doing too, because it's just nice. You just render the field and it looks pretty and you don't have to remember to add a class on there or whatever. But I know that used to be the way that you did it in Bootstrap. You do a class and then you like change the classes when it came to like trying to splice these things together and whatever. And it's fine. But then you have to go look up, the checkbox is a special thing and it needs a special wrapper. And it always just was an absolute mess to like remember a lot of those nuanced ones. And I like this approach a lot better where it's like, hey, just you render the input and voila, it looks nice.
Yeah. And so now when I actually see classes like in Rails ERB views and templates, I know that they serve a purpose of something other than a generic input. I haven't done buttons yet. I need to. One problem I did run into this is I have the board facing side. So like the Go Rails job board has like a public facing template or layout. And then I have the back end of Jobboardly, but they both share application.tailwind.css. So when people are posting jobs on your site, I want the border around the text input when it's active to match your brand color. And so I was really kind of like, this is already falling apart. But what I ended up doing was just putting a data attribute on the body of the job board layouts. And in CSS, just saying data board input. And then all it does is apply CSS variables for the colors. So it's pretty...
CSS variables are awesome. They're like really cool for stuff like that, where you want to have the same view and classes and everything, and then you just swap things out with the variables. It is a really cool feature.
And you can have a fallback for CSS variables. And this kind of goes back to the JIT and the nested attributes thing I was talking about, of where you can have it be like text dash and then open brackets. And then it's the CSS variable name or your fallback color.
That's cool. I didn't know about the fallback. Yeah. I am using the JIT. I can't remember what they call it. The square brackets. I'm actually using that in
like
my
the customs.
Yeah, the directives. No, I don't remember what they are, but I'm using them for variables for the most part. So when you go to Chris's job site, it's red. And so the avatars, they're in a component, a view component, but the job avatars are literally saying bj-color-square brackets var -- brand color. It's amazing. It really reduces the friction of having to allow people to choose their own colors, things like that. I mean, it's just, I adore it. I can't imagine a Tailwind world without JIT now.
Yeah, it's definitely changed the game.
You don't miss the 30 megabyte CSS files it used to generate.
Or having to configure PurgeCSS on your own.
Yeah, I mean, they made some big strides with it, with PurgeCSS, all the, like, every option being available to you all the time is fantastic. So the JIT really saved a lot of configuration trouble and everything, because it was like, oh, well, your orange color doesn't show up because orange isn't in the default color thing, because it would just add too much to the CSS file. Like, now you just get the optimized version every time. Love it. Couldn't ask for more. So it's in a really good spot. I'm sure they got a lot of good improvements on the way too, but they solved a lot of problems with the JIT. I think it turned out great.
It was huge. And I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, that the JIT is using PurgeCSS, which is like an amazing tool. When we were getting started with Tailwind, it was just like another thing. We're already using PostCSS with Webpacker, and now we need PurgeCSS in order to do this. And abstracting that away is magical.
Yeah, and it's really cool. We now, instead of using Webpacker, we just use the Tailwind CSS CLI. So we use the official tool and all of its features instead of the old. We'll figure out how to get this compiling in our build tool and whatever. That was always a rigmarole to get sorted, and then it would break regularly and you just have to maintain it, and no fun, but now it's slick.
It is slick. It's been fun.
The bundling Rails gems. Those really made it the other half of the simplicity. Anyway, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it's just made it fun working on Shopboardly and using Tailwind, because I started the rebuild of it in Bootstrap. Like, you know that, Chris. I had built basically the whole thing with Bootstrap because I like the idea of being able to frame something up quickly. But then when it was done, it was like, I don't know how to customize this enough to not feel like Bootstrap. Our designer and my previous coworker, Kyle Fox, they know how to like customize Bootstrap to make it look different. And I can't do that. So I got to do something. And that's what led me to my Tailwind, trying to think outside the box.
Yeah. I just used one of their templates for the Rails Hackathon homepage, and
I saw that.
It's so nice to have a handful of templates like that. But I will say that they only ship those in Next.js and React. So instead of downloading that and running it and trying to port that over, I just grab the HTML from the browser and then drop it in to my Rails app and then undo stuff and make it dynamic that way. But it is still one of those things where like there's just so much, because they put all the attention to detail and like the shadows and everything else, which causes sometimes significantly extra amount of divs and things like that. If you ever poke around at their buttons, they got the shadows fine-tuned, but they got to put a wrapper around the button as a span or whatever so that it's got the proper shadow in the right location. They go to all that attention to detail, but man, it can be tough to sort through all that code and figure out, like, if you grab a nav bar, it takes you a second because you're like, oh yeah, this is a responsive nav bar, but they can't pull off the same nav on mobile as in desktop. So there's actually two menus in here. One's only visible on mobile, one's visible on small and up. I can't tell you how many times I'll copy one of the components and then realize like, crap. I edited this on the mobile portion and I got to go find where the desktop version is and put the right links in. And that's one of those things where like, I think components would be tremendous for those things, because you can say, here's the links and these should be on both desktop and mobile. And maybe you need different ones for each, but you can just give it the links. It can figure out, hey, these go here, these go there. These styles are on desktop, these styles are on mobile. And your component can kind of abstract a lot of that knowledge that's in the CSS structure, because that's, I think, hard to wrap your head around. And I think a lot of people complain about Tailwind for that reason. It's not just the Bootstrap nav class and nav links. It's now like container and a background and then the hamburger button for mobile and then all these different things that are kind of like the extra polish. Because I think the Bootstrap approach was generally like, can we make it one way and then just restructure it for mobile? Right. But they take that attention to detail a lot more serious in Tailwind. And I think that naturally just adds some complexity to the HTML layouts and CSS sometimes.
There's two things there. The first is that the React components, whenever I copy them out of Tailwind UI, they make me drool over things like, oh, they just defined a const of links and they can reuse it. And then I'm copying the HTML version that has both, and I'm like finding and replacing, and it's the way it is.
Why can't you just use a const? That's what I do. I define a const with like certain styles in them, and then I use the options I supply to the component to like call that key from the const hash.
Two things there. That depends on if I'm using components or not. Typically, when I'm starting out on the app, I'm just going to grab the nav and I'm going to paste it into a partial. It makes me think, man, I wish what I was going back to, it's the choice between the Rails experience. Do I want to stay in the Rails ecosystem of rendering views and working with Turbo and things like that? Or could I move quicker, pulling the React components out, but not working the Rails way? It's just a choice we make. It's difficult. The other thing I wanted to say, when you're talking about Bootstrap, there's just like a nav and you have the desktop and the mobile version. They're the same, right? Like they just work off a little bit of CSS and JavaScript. At the same time, that is how we get locked into everything looks like Bootstrap. And so like, yeah, it is the cost that Tailwind takes on of, no, like we want to make it look good and polished and things like that. So basically.
Yeah, because like you were doing it in the Bootstrap style, you'd be able to write your nav selector and then everything else can be nested in there with the media screen sizes.
Right.
But because you don't have that necessarily with Tailwind, you like are better off just writing two separate menus and getting exactly what you want instead of within the limitations of like these links have to have classes and they're always going to be in the same location in the HTML. And we got to figure out how to shove them in the right order now. And they might be horizontal. And then now on mobile, they got to be vertical. That stuff is pretty limiting if you are trying to do good UI on both versions with the exact same HTML. That's like really the big trouble there is you don't want to, but you really do need two duplicate menus that are visible on different sizes for really nice responsive design.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think basically with both talking about choosing between doing it the Rails way and pulling the React components in, and even talking about using Bootstrap and Tailwind, it is all just trade-offs. And I think I'm at the point now where the trade-offs I want to make are, I want it to look polished because I think there are some people that can spin up an app without polish and be successful. But I feel like to be competitive, I feel like MVP these days needs to be polished. And so I'm willing to make that trade-off to use Tailwind over Bootstrap. I also just enjoy working Tailwind. But then on the Rails side, I also move quickest in Rails. So even though it's like an inconvenience for me to take these HTML templates and componentize them or update them, it is still probably faster than me trying to build a React app. It is an interesting problem. That
you
said,
just need to build a React to stimulus converter.
Yeah, I'll get right on that. After I finish my Tailwind view component library, that'll be my next.
Boom.
I will say Inertia, which is a library for Laravel and Rails, it tries to bridge the gap between single page apps using React and Vue with Rails. And it is something I've done before. I haven't shipped that app, but I don't know. Then you lose that hotwire approach. So I don't know.
Yeah, that one's a core decision to how you implement things. So if you choose that route, it is deciding on an SPA or not. Effectively, you're kind of doing that with a blend of the Turbo style of things, but
the Ruby blend.
Yes.
There was one other thing I want to talk about that I don't know if we've talked about. I found a lot of joy in it. I'm looking for Andrew's acceptance. That's all I'm looking for. And so I'm hoping this will really solidify that.
Hamill?
I'm out. So I started adopting Vue components, job boardly. I had them split between, there's some board specific ones, some backend specific ones, and then some just general ones. One of the ones I'm most proud of, and I actually learned this approach when I was doing Inertia. I made a pagination component, and the way I built it was I'm using Pagey, but Pagey has a metadata option where you can basically all the data that builds the pagination with the Vue helpers and Rails, you can just get that data, and it's an extra call. It's like Pagey metadata with Pagey as the argument, but I store that as a pagination instance variable and just pass it to this component, which then renders the Tailwind UI version of pagination. And I've been able to use it only like 4 times now, but I don't have to ever think about it. I just render out this component with this object and it works with Turbo. It's beautiful and I love it.
You have been accepted.
Yes.
I will say that I can only use it 4 times. That's 3 times more than most Rails developers' components I see. If you're a Rails developer writing components, being able to use it 3 more times, that's more than the majority of y'all. So that's a big win for me.
Yeah. I'm going to talk in positives as the app continues to grow and I need to paginate more things. It'll make it hella quicker because I have it built. I also componentized the layout because I have a sidebar layout in the back end. And so I componentized that. Yeah, it's cool. I'm having fun. It's fun just building. I'm in my little Zen garden. I like it.
Yeah. I mean, I've said this repeatedly, but I mean, I used to think I was just going in circles with my personal site. But after 300 commits on my redesign, I realized I'm not really as much going in circles as I am experimenting with like a component architecture, finding, okay, wait, this breaks down here, restarting, and then trying again. And then like Chris said earlier, like it takes a lot of time and practice, and it really does. But now, like where I'm at now compared to like a year ago is completely different. I'm obsessed with component architecture. I love reading about it. Every time someone releases a new design system, I'm looking at what props they're using and how they're styling certain things and how they're handling certain things. And it's just a blast, but it takes practice. And that's why I don't think anyone who's like, oh, I'm going to start using Vue component. Now my Rails app is perfectly componentized. Like that never is going to work out the first time because of what Chris and I were talking about earlier about there is architecture involved, right? It's not just a slap it in there situation anymore. If you want to have these reusable components, you have to spend time architecting them, trying things that don't work. You have to fail before you can succeed. Boom.
Yeah. You reminded me of my first real serious project was that Python recreation of the apt package manager. I rewrote that darn thing like 14 times over 2 or 3 years. And every time it was like, oh, I'll take every package and create an instance of a class for it. And then it was like, oh, that's actually really inefficient and using 800 megs of RAM to store everything in memory. Maybe I'll try a hash now. Then it was like significantly smaller. And then building plugins and other like customization things. Each time I'd rewrite it, I'd end up way more flexible and it'd be like a lot less code and whatever else. And I was just enjoying the process of build it, learn what does and doesn't work for this type of problem, redo it, try it again, see how I improved it, see how I made it worse, try that part again. It feels a little bit like you're redoing work, but in a way, like you're just like teaching yourself from really practical problems. And it's great. You should just rewrite stuff for the fun of it, see how you can improve it and compare it to the previous version. It's a great way to really learn stuff. Saw Tenderlove mentioned he is going to cut a new release of Rails today on a Friday. So hope you ship that to production and then log off for the weekend.
On it.
He said it was just bug fixes, so it's not like a security update or anything. It's just
surely nothing can go wrong then.
Yeah, it's not possible. But yeah, looking forward to that. Maybe it will include the Redis. I don't know if they were backporting that to 7.0, but the Redis 5 gem came out and action cables locked to 4.8 at the highest. So I know like main had PR or whatever. It actually may not even be ready yet. There was like an issue with Sidekick initially and then Rescue or something had an issue. So it may not be in there yet, but I'm hoping they backport that because it'd be nice to use the new Redis 5 gem in Rails 7. But yeah, other than that, Rails Hackathon's next weekend.
Oh my God, it's next weekend?
Yeah, it came up way too fast. We've got a lot of people. It's only been up for like a couple days, and there's like 36 teams registered so far. And there was quite a few hundred people on the email list and joining Slack to. It's just fun watching people get together, and like some people have never used Hotwire and they're meeting each other and forming teams and tuple sponsoring. So they're going to be able to like pair program remotely wherever they are in the world and make friends and learn Hotwire and stuff. It's going to be awesome. So I'm excited for it, but I got to go build a little bit more stuff for that. We're going to have GitHub repos for each team, and then like push your code to that, and they'll just more or less be for us to check for anybody cheating and importing their already finished application or whatever. But that was kind of fun because I haven't actually built a GitHub app before. So that was my first time playing with that. And boy, it's a weird authentication process where you like create the app, you install it, then you generate a private key, and they use a private key to generate a JWT to make an API request to get an access token for the installation. And then you can finally use that to actually make a request, create a GitHub repo. And I was like, what in the heck? So that's on my to-do list to make a little screencast out of and show people how to actually integrate a GitHub app and explain like the difference between the old OAuth stuff that is pretty much not recommended for most GitHub integrations these days. But GitHub apps seems a little bit convoluted and not super well documented, at least for the API stuff. Knowing what thing has permissions to do what seems a little. There's a little works with GitHub apps label on the API endpoints, but not a like you need the access token or whatever thing, permissions and scopes and stuff. So, but yeah, I'm excited for that. Should be a fun weekend. It's going to be a long weekend.
By the time this is out, that will have already happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Colin's flying into St. Louis, and we're going to have a hackathon in person here. So that should be fun. You'll be here in St. Louis in a few hours, huh, Jason?
Well, now I feel left out.
Well, you're welcome to come to our baby shower. You just need to get a flight like right now.
All right. Let me call my travel agent. I did look it up the other day, though, because I think Jason was on some smoke, and I was like, Jason, like, I looked it up. I was like, I could get a flight out of here and be in Memphis in 3 hours. And so, yeah, I'm sure I could do the same thing for St. Louis.
That's
like,
fast.
Do it. You won't.
Phoenix says,
Bet.
You won't
Bet?
do it. You won't.
to where?
St. Louis.
All right.
Make it happen.
Come on.
All right.
My kids will love you.
I am great with kids.
We got our pool heater hooked up so you can enjoy a warm pool.
All right.
Pool and a hot tub now. So
See y'all there.
we got you covered. And then I'm getting up at like, I think I calculated I got to start the smoker at 3 a.m. to have
Nice.
pulled pork all smoked and ready for noon or so on Saturday. So I'll have some fresh barbecue, but not entirely looking forward to getting up in the middle of the night and then getting all that set up and then going back to bed. But
I was going to ask, are you going to stay up?
probably not. But it always does creep me out that stuff's on fire while I'm sleeping. I don't do great with that, but you gotta risk it for the brisket, right?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Thanks
That's
for listening to the #1 Ruby podcast. Let's go.
Hey!
If You Gotta Risk It for the Brisket isn't the name of this episode, will be the number 10 podcast.